my face in a while, and you'll only see it briefly. I have the lucky position of welcoming Konstantin Savinkov. We do have a slide that we're going to be popping up. I believe Talia is bringing it up quickly, and it'll just introduce the title of the talk. But basically, here we go. All right. There we are. So the next 30 minutes will be spent on dodging AI biases and future-proof MT solutions. So that is all I'll say. We'll stop sharing our side, and the slides are yours, Konstantin. Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks. Starting. Okay. And here we go. Do you see it all right?
Yes, perfect.
Good. So thanks for the intro. Hello, everyone. And in this talk, I will consider practical cases when machine translation biases create obstacles in building a global presence and inclusive multilingual work environment for an international company. And we discuss how to dodge those biases using multi-vendor MT solutions, and in some cases go further by leveraging those biases to create more diverse and inclusive translations. So typically when you have an MT discussion, you have either buyer angle or LSP angle or TMS angle or MT vendor angle. So we're at intent on not an LSP, not a TMS, and not an MT vendor. So that requires an explanation. I will start from some context. So what we do, we help global companies onboard AI. And about 80% of AI initiatives fail at large enterprises. And the reason is rarely that AI is not there yet. So it's often wrong vendor selected, issues while fitting the model to a specific purpose, and challenges integrating the AI solution with the existing software, human workflows, and the supply chain. And for now, we have focused our efforts on machine translation specifically, mainly because we see one of the massive gaps between the AI capabilities and adoption. And we've built a set of tools and practices to procure right vendors, to fit them to the purpose, to integrate them with the existing business processes to solve a specific task, which may be localization or customer support, and then to repurpose and reuse those models to serve many other MT needs across the enterprise. And then finally, to have it continuously improving as you get new data and user feedback. So I really admire the conference topic, future of function, future of work. I believe that AI has a unique role here because, conventional software is a mere tool used by workers to increase productivity. And artificial intelligence works in the loop or alongside us humans. It still may be a too strong statement in 2020, but I believe that AI models, they increasingly feel more like our coworkers and colleagues than tools. And their performance depends on the vast volumes of unknown data they're trained on, which feels really like experience. There's no way to learn how they work for your business case until you try it, which is similar to test assignment. They require additional adaptation on your data, so think onboarding, and then they can continuously learn on the new data if there's a process in place, and quickly lose relevance if there's none. So it really feels like more like colleagues. And as we advance, we may envision companies built of hybrid teams of cognitive models. Just some of those models are in human minds, and others being artificial intelligence. And we all know how essential the company culture and ethics are. So we want to work in welcoming, diverse, and inclusive environments, and we want to communicate those values to our user communities and around the world. And we want our employees to be safe and happy. We want our users to feel welcomed and empowered. And can we achieve our goals if only a part of the team aligns their culture and values with the company. So highly unlikely. And what if, what if your text is read by your colleague through machine translation as sexist? Or what if your message translated in a corporate messenger uses an improper, harsh tone of voice? And with artificial intelligence being increasingly more ubiquitous, we have this issue sooner or later. And we're currently making the first steps in understanding and solving those issues. And I will share some of the findings in this talk. So as I mentioned, we explore different bottlenecks a company may have when onboarding the artificial intelligence. So some of them may be purely technical, such as just integrating machine translation with existing software systems. Some are more linguistic, how to fit machine translation to the purpose and make it adhere to the specific domain and terminology. Others are economic, as adding AI on the enterprise side inevitably challenges existing supply chains and pricing models. But in this talk, I'm going to focus on different ones. I would like to focus on specific challenges a global company faces when applying machine translation to facilitate international multilingual communication with its customer base or between the company employees or between its users, such as buyers and sellers, riders and drivers, landlords and tenants. And when it's about public communications, such as marketing materials or product information, it typically goes through rigorous review procedures. And when machine translation is used to optimize content creation for such purposes, frankly, a little changes because it still goes through a human review to make sure it meets standard. Our real-time communication is different. It's harder to control. There is no way to enforce those requirements here by pre-moderation of a legal or PR department. The only way to ensure your internal communication meets the standards is to build a proper company culture. And thankfully, we're getting better at this, this mass environments, not only at San Francisco headquarters, but also in all subsidiaries across the globe, building ethical global businesses. And then we're just, adding machine translation. So one might say is just a productivity tool, much like Microsoft Word or email. And I would argue it's not. So being an intermediary in our communication, machine translation becomes really part of the team. And we'll see it more and more going forward. It's not just a tool, it's our digital coworker, and all its biases and features affect our culture. So let's discuss three important things to look after. So two are gender and tone of voice biases, which transform our messages as they are translated. And the third one is privacy, because you may feel you're chatting directly with your coworker, while that translation may actually trigger some service located in a different country, imposing certain regulatory risks. So first, gender bias. So now in state-of-the-art research of gender bias in machine translation, they use this carefully crafted sentences where they linguistically imply a feminine form of a traditionally masculine word, like on this example you see, for Spanish, typically around professions. And after machine translation is done, they analyze if this bias is strong enough to overcome this linguistic dependency. So there are data sets for that, like WinMT Challenge. However, we found that in the practical day-to-day translations, there's another form of gender bias which is more important. And I'm speaking about, I'm talking about short phrases that lack context to define a proper gender, as you may see in these examples. And after machine translation, such phrases may become either feminine or masculine, depending on the bias. However, the gender context is often available as user metadata and can be used to guide the machine translation. So we run a small test, 31 sentences of customer support dialogues translated to French through 7 most popular stock pre-trained NLP models, not customized. And you may see that most of the translations default to masculine form. Then how to fix that? So one way, okay, I know only one machine translation tool which allows selecting gender, which is this Google Translate web application. And but it does work for French, works for Spanish, maybe for some other languages. And then this option is not available in the commercial Google Translate API, so one would have to, copy and paste text to this free web application, which claims usage rights on your data and so on. Not really cool. Another option is to instruct operators, for example, in customer support, to build long phrases with enough gender context to ensure correct translation. However, you can hardly require employees and users, so this is also not the best option to solve this. And the third option is to use some natural language processing. And here, all sorts of simple edits may not work because, inflections and language complexity. However, it's possible to use the available metadata to inject context, gender context into the text to be translated, and then do some sort of automated post-editing. And as you will see on the following slides, it doesn't guarantee 100% accuracy, but it really improves the situation for certain MT engines. So you may see here, we run this experiment by doing this adjustment to feminine gender, and you see that for many MT engines, we significantly increased amount of feminine translations for such phrases. And if not that, then at least it makes some of the translations more neutral, like for this engine D. And when we do it in the opposite direction, I should say masculine, then it just works perfectly, making just everything completely masculine, which overall signifies that all commercial MT engines are very strongly biased towards masculine translations. So even providing the right context doesn't fix it. And that's probably something which industry needs to address. And the second feature is tone of voice bias. And, English speakers are lucky not having to bother about all those honorifics, at least for the last 500 years. For others, there's at least two primary forms, which are formal and informal. And most of the MT engines are very inconsistent, turning translation of a dialogue, multiple phrases into a disaster with formal and informal tone just mixed 50-50 for the same dialogue. So here you see another experiment where it's about 200 segments. Also customer support dialogue translated from English to German. And you see, we use standard markers to identify the tone of voice of results in German phrase, if it's formal and informal. And you may see that there's one MT engine that is biased completely to all formal by default. It's actually DeepL. And it's a mix for others. And I need to say that the main goal here was to obtain informal translations. So we actually collected phrases that most typically translated formally to German. With random sampling, I think the mix would be closer to 50-50, but here we really wanted to pick some challenging phrases and see how we can improve. So how to fix that? Again, there are several options. So one of them is exactly DeepL, which has a native tone of voice control feature in the API, although few people know about that. It's pretty accurate, resulting in about 99.5 translation being informal. However, what if you need a custom model and terminology, or another machine translation agent has a better linguistic quality for you, or you need more tolerance to acronyms and typos than you get from DeepL. And if you just go for this feature, you may actually compromise linguistic quality. So there's another way, which is just generate synthetic data and customize the engines. You can customize doing domain adaptation, things like Google AutoML. However, custom translation is about 4 times more expensive. Many engines also charge for training as well. And it's also unclear how those artificial phrases affect overall linguistic quality. So the third option here is, again, to use some MT-agnostic natural language processing. And again, tone of voice features, they typically go hand by hand with inflections, which renders all simple edits useless, but with some creative NLP, we can solve it to a certain extent. And here you may see, if we're doing adjustment to informal tone of voice, we can reach, on the top of this black box commercial MT engines, we can reach a significant improvement of increase of informal translations. And much like with gender bias, if you do adjustment in the opposite direction, we actually make it almost totally formal. So you may compare with this default picture, which again sort of signifies that there is a strong bias towards formal translations by default across MT engines. And then finally, let's briefly touch on privacy and a little bit of geopolitics. So as you may see on this picture, many countries regulate how different types of data can be processed, mostly touching healthcare, financial data, HR, and personal data, personally identifiable information. And you'll likely come across some of these content types in your work communication. So you should be aware where this data goes for translation. And here you may see information on the public cloud MT deployments collected from the MT provider websites. And seemingly there is only one MT provider located in Canada, just Amazon, 2 in Russia, Yandex and Prompt, 4 in Australia, and none in Africa and Latin America. And we lack some information. We didn't find where DeepL deployed. We know they train engines in Iceland in supercomputer center. We don't know where they do inference. Also, some other providers not very transparent. Like for example, Google says it's available globally, which most likely means in the United States. And also some of the MT providers, as you may see, they provide private deployment options. So you can actually deploy them wherever you want, maybe at certain additional expense. So one option to mitigate these regulatory risks is to select the cloud MT providers based on the region where the data to be translated originates from. Also, some MT vendors provide private cloud deployment options, so they may be deployed where needed. But again, when you optimize MT vendor choice based on these non-linguistic features, you potentially may compromise the quality. So another option here is to just carefully craft data processing agreements and data protection clauses with legal teams to make sure it's all covered, which, for example, we do a lot with European companies. And finally, it's possible to, again, using some NLP, identify and remove potentially restricted information before sending it to the MT engine, or replacing with some sort of placeholders, and then changing it back in the translated text. So that's actually it. And to summarize, artificial intelligence becomes more and more ubiquitous, almost like a coworker than a tool. And when it's biased, it may damage work environment and culture. So today, as you have seen, machine translation is mostly masculine by gender and pretty inconsistent by the tone of voice, although biased towards formal, means if you want to provide informal feminine translations, you'll see the most hurdles. It's possible to dodge those biases using creative natural language processing, although, of course, it would be much better if machine translation vendors provided us with proper controls themselves. And much like DeepL provides for tone of voice. And finally, just to highlight, you need to make sure where your machine translation sits deployed, especially if it's some default empty system, because you need to make sure that you stay compliant. So thank you. I really appreciate being part of Global Sec. Happy to answer your questions. And also I'd love to get feedback from people who also use machine translation to let their multilingual audience talk, like how you solve these bias problems and what sort of feedback you're getting from the users. Yeah.
All right,
Thanks.
thank you very much, Konstantin. I'm gonna stop your screen sharing for just a second so that people can see. Here we go. Love the presentation. I think it's super interesting in that how you presented Intento and kind of the problems you're solving, and partially because, you know, we have quite a few attendees who are in the localization space who really get what you're talking about, but we also have people who are just like, the way you explained it, it's like, oh yeah, there was an aha moment, I think, for some folks of like, oh man, this can be used to really make the customer conversation or speaking with colleagues even much more feasible and less of an issue. Allison pointed out our digital coworker who comes with its own biases. It's an interesting way to think about. So I think we can all agree about that. I'll jump to the question now. You showed examples of French and German, right? But what about other languages? I think this was talked about earlier a little bit too, but language like Asian languages like Japanese or Korean. Can you talk a little bit more about that process?
Yeah, we have two dimensions. So German was actually the first one, and we have two dimensions where we explore it. So one is just by request from our clients, which use those tools in their live chats and work environment. And here we have this list of usual suspects, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and so on. Then, speaking of more complex, frankly, we did not dare to work with Korean yet, because I know there's 14 different honorifics, I think, at least. That's probably a topic for a future endeavors.
Awesome. Yeah, I can only imagine how the difficulties. I have been playing around with some of these for Japanese, and so I understand. You mentioned NLP to kind of control the tone and voice gender of machine translation. That's something that you currently provide on your platform then?
Yeah, so we sort of, since we're sit in the middle, we're not just connecting to different empty systems, we also do this sort of fine-tuning beyond they can do, which is we can do this gender adjustment, tone of voice adjustment, then stuff like profanity filtering, pseudonymization, and protecting certain information from being broken during translation and stuff like that. So yeah, it's basically part of our tool set.
Okay. Allison from Gala actually wrote in a question asking how are companies solving bias problems currently? Do they handle it during post-editing? Do they ignore it, or do you?
The simple answer is they mostly ignore, but the honest answer is a little bit more complex. Is the only reason why we stumbled upon these issues is because at some point, and I mean, it's publicly presented at Lockwork with IKEA, we built this nice continuous improvement system where they get feedback from end users about translation quality all the time. And it's just because of this feedback we noticed this issue, because people started to highlight specific issues they see. So I would say I think that most of the companies ignore it, not because it's not sufficient, but just because they are not getting feedback about their translations.
Okay. We still have a couple more minutes, so I'll just keep asking some questions, and as people ask, I will bring them up. In terms of kind of the important factors, what are those factors when you're of a high-performing kind of machine translation strategy? So what would be, what are the most important factors that you would say in terms of that kind of strategy?
Well, I think the only factor is ROI. Basically, it's an ability to estimate ROI in terms of the most important use case for the company. And as I have this picture somewhere that there are some usual suspects as just traditional and agile localization, marketing content, but then there's lots of cases around customer support and community and office productivity. And that's the most important, to understand where they can get the most benefit. And then second, which is typically underestimated and it's being typically discovered much later, is that around all problems which business solves, there is certain supply chain of vendors, and like in case of localization, language services, it may be quite long supply chain. And when you add, when you own machine translation, it's a good thing is when you own it as a buyer, you can actually get more benefits. They are not going to some supplier margin. They stay on your table. It's a good thing. So complex thing is that it typically leads to rebuilding those supply chains because they do not account for you as a buyer using machine translation. Like for example, you may see that on the market, the most popular approach for pricing post-editing still is flat discount, which is for a little bit counterintuitive because it does really depends on the MT quality. And if you're as a buyer improve this quality, you become more and more surprised that you still have the same discount, right? And that's this factor that's not only about just dropping in technology and not even about training people, it's also rebuilding quite a bit of business relationships. So that's, I think, should be considered.
Understood. We have a question that came in through the chat. Actually, Talia asked it. On your platform for NLP, how do you cluster related words to optimize the trained models for multilingual NLP?
Interesting. Cluster related. We I think we don't go that deep because our goal is to make uniform experience across working with different MT vendors, meaning that we have tools for data cleaning, but then after the data is cleaned and we make sure there's no bad things left, we just hand it over to these technologies provided by all the vendors like Google, Microsoft, and so on. And it's up to them how to deal with those problems. We just and then what we do, we just evaluate who solved it better for this specific data set. Yeah. So.
All right, that makes sense. One last question then, and what would be the one key takeaway from your presentation today that you'd like us all to remember?
It's that machine translation and AI in general, it's more than a tool. And if you're mindful about how your teammates behave, you should equally be mindful about how your machine translation behaves, because it's lots of similarities with how humans work.
Wonderful. Well, everybody please give him a round of applause, and thank you very much, Konstantin, for taking time to talk with us today.